Now, in the case of the visual system, which is also necessary for language processing, things are a little more complicated. Gee, this looks like a pretty horrendous diagram, doesn't it? There's lots of numbers and lots of different arrows and connections, but let's try to make it as simple as possible. So here, if we just focus on comprehension of written words, which is one of my research specialties, in other words, reading or single word recognition, then we know that there's a lot of different brain areas that get involved. So this is something to consider when we go back to that theme of modularity in the brain for cognitive processing. Let's start with the eye, which is the obvious place to visit, because the eye receives the stimuli from the left or right visual fields, and in the case of text, we generally move our eyes from one word to another using saccadic eye movements. So there's an awful lot to do with the eye in the process of reading. So here's the eye with all of its important functions. What's most relevant to us is that all of the light and changes in light that are perceived through the retina and the lens are projected to the optic nerve, which then leads to changes in signals, psychophysical signals, which indicate some change to the texture, the light, the orientation of objects in the visual field. That lands first of all in the lateral geniculate nucleus, which we've mentioned before, and that occurs via the optic tract, one of the cranial nerves. Then in the thalamus, we see a process that involves the activity of the lateral geniculate nucleus, which will project the visual information to the occipital lobe, right at the very back of the brain. Now, just like the auditory signal that is processed by areas 41 and 42, the idea here with area 17, 18, etc. is that this is a visual processor that will be processing different parts of the psychophysical input, the light, the texture, the shade, the motion, the color, etc. So this is area 17 processes the very simple changes in the pattern of light that we see. 18 and 19 become more specialized and process things like texture, color, motion. So we see an increasing specialization as we go deeper into the cortex in the occipital lobe. Now, the visual areas that are most relevant for reading are what we call the ventral and the dorsal stream. In other words, the what and the where. The dorsal stream is at the top, and that's because the word dorsal refers to upper, and that is what we think is specialized for the where of all visual information, not just written words, but all kinds of information in the visual field. Where is that information? So in terms of the coordinates of space, x, y, z coordinates, we want to know where in space is the object that we're perceiving, and that's the job of the dorsal ventral stream. Contrary to that is the ventral stream. Now, the ventral stream is specialized for the what of the visual processing system. What is it that's being recognized? Is it a face? Is it a house? Is it a pen? Is it some other object in the visual field? So the what system is ventral because ventral refers to lower, and the processing of the object that we see is concerned with activation in this area here. In fact, the inferior temporal gyrus is intimately involved in that. Now, if we take a look at reading as a skill, then we can make a simple map of this. We would activate the eye, optic nerve, project information down to the lateral geniculate nucleus, which would then be passed on to the occipital lobe. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because if we take a look at these areas, the yellow and the purple, what we're seeing here are two separate parts that we think are necessary for reading. The first one is the occipitotemporal reading system. Now, this is the system that we believe is important for recognizing the characteristics of the single letters and therefore words that are projected to the retina through visual word processing. So we think that there is recognition of letters in this area here. Coincidentally, we think that there's also recognition of other symbols like numerals, but that's another story. So letters are thought to be processed here, which then projects to recognition of a specific word, at least in English, and that carries on so that the ventral stream seems to be in charge of processing the meaning of words after it has been passed through the occipitotemporal reading system. Interesting question about what might happen with Chinese characters. That's something that we work on in our lab, but we can come work with us if you'd like to know more. Another interesting fact about this region that I want to point out is that Area 19 is specialized for color vision. That's processing the colors of the visual input. Now, if you notice here in this yellowy area, where we think the occipitotemporal reading system begins, let's say around about here, there's a junction so that the color recognition area of the occipital lobe meets the area where we start to recognize shapes, symbols like letters and numbers. Now, what's really interesting about this is that we observe in some people a phenomenon called synesthesia, which is the tendency to think of a number as having a specific color. Not particularly interesting, you might think, but only about 1% of the population actually do this. Now, the reason that I think I find this interesting is because the first thing is that 2 or 3 members of my own family are synesthetes. So I remember once describing this to my mother, this condition of synesthesia. It's not an impairment, it's not a disorder, it's just something that some people do. And she said, well, what do you mean 2 is always red? It's just red. And then I asked my brother, what's 2? And he said, well, it's nothing, because most of us don't think of 2 as having a color. Turns out that my mother's granddaughter has the same synesthesia condition, where they have very strong views about the number and letter having a particular color. And you can retest the same person with the same letters and the same numbers over many, many years, and the colors don't change. So 2 is always red and is red for many years. Not something you would imagine to be problematic. It's not. It's just interesting because what it shows is that the area of the brain that processes color, which is very close by to the area of the brain that processes symbols like letters and numbers, is structurally adjacent. So in terms of the neurons that are shared, there's quite a lot of overlap. It's just that in about 1% of people, there doesn't seem to be any differentiation at this point between color recognition and symbol recognition. And as a consequence, the two overlap. And when people are learning symbols like letters and numbers, they attach a color to it, which is kind of a weird thing to do. Having said that, some other synesthetes might, in fact, have odors that they smell. So an A smells like rain, or a 2 smells like, or tastes like a cake. So it's not just visual input that shows this phenomenon. But nevertheless, it's quite interesting that most synesthetes have this color number condition, and it's very reliable across people over their entire life.